As homicide levels in Mexico plateau around 35,000 deaths annually, the López Obrador administration has underscored how U.S. arms flows facilitate organized crime and lethal violence in Mexico. Meanwhile, as Mexican cartels have diversified their portfolios to include increased fentanyl production, annual opioid-related deaths in the U.S. have surpassed the 100,000 mark. Last year, the U.S. Mexico high-level security dialogue revitalized bilateral efforts to address these interdependent security challenges. The processes and strategies established by the Merida Initiative in 2008 no longer suffice to address the novel factors that enable and perpetuate crime, violence, and drug consumption on both sides of the border. The resulting Bicentennial Framework demonstrates both countries' willingness to tailor their approaches to the evolving security and health concerns by prioritizing communities' well-being. We are hopeful that today's conversation will provide insights for both Mexican and U.S. officials to continue moving the needle on security and public health matters. We are honored to support the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement and Assistant Secretary Todd Robinson's efforts to critically assess these changing dynamics in the supply and demand of illicit substances and their enabling environment to better inform bilateral strategies to protect people on both sides of the border, prevent transborder crime, and pursue criminal networks. To introduce Assistant Secretary Robinson, please welcome Ambassador Mark Green, Director, President, and CEO of the Wilson Center. Prior to joining the Wilson Center, he served as Executive Director of the McCain Institute and Administrator of USAID, President of the International Republican Institute, President and CEO of the Initiative for Global Development, and Senior Director at the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. He also served as the U.S. Ambassador to Tanzania from mid-2007 to early 2009. Before that, he served 4 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Wisconsin's 8th District. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Green.
Thank you, Sam, for that kind introduction, and welcome everyone to the Wilson Center. We are congressionally chartered, scholarship-driven, fiercely nonpartisan, and independent, and also able to tap into the expertise and leadership of a number of people associated with the topic we have here today, including our own distinguished fellow, Ambassador Bill Brownfield, who once held the role that our featured guest held, among other posts, and our own Tony Wayne, who also ambassador to Mexico and has served for so long and contributed to the center in so many ways. Thanks to both of you for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, I recently had the opportunity to travel to Mexico City along with our Mexico Institute. I had the chance to meet with representatives from non-governmental organizations and civil society, business, and government. I was reminded over and over again that the links between the U.S. and Mexico go well beyond geography. Our cultural and economic ties extend far back in history, long before boundaries were drawn and redrawn. I was struck in the meetings that I had by 2 broad themes. First, a sincere desire with everyone on finding ways to strengthen the U.S.-Mexico relationship, a recognition of how much that relationship means to employers, to employees, and so many working families, especially in a time of intense attention to our critical supply chains and energy needs. The second theme was also important and relevant to today's discussion. I heard about a sense of anxiety that without strong action, we could miss some of the key opportunities in the U.S.-Mexico relationship that are on hand these days. And one of the most important areas for us to tackle that if we don't tackle could lead to that sense of anxiety only going up is taking on security cooperation. We realize that if we work together, U.S. and Mexico, on security cooperation, that can produce important gains for both countries at all levels. And that really is what brings us here today. Since 2007, the Merida Initiative has been a bipartisan effort aimed at fostering and strengthening security cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico. But there's a new effort underway to bolster that partnership. The U.S. and Mexico have announced the Bicentennial Framework for Security, Public Health, and Safe Communities. It's an ambitious plan for a comprehensive long-term approach to strengthening bilateral security cooperation. This new framework includes commitments for dismantling human smuggling operations, combating the financial networks of criminal organizations, and preventing transborder crime. Leadership on our side for reinforcing security cooperation with Mexico rests with the State Department's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. INL, or what some have called the Drugs and Thugs Bureau, is expanding its work not only to enhance collaboration on the federal level, but also in working with different states throughout Mexico. INL has helped to train thousands in the Mexican police force, including specialized police units focusing on preventing femicide and other forms of gender-based violence. In addition, INL has strengthened Mexico's forensics capacity to identify fentanyl precursors so that Mexican prosecutors and chemists can properly present evidence at trials. The second meeting of the U.S. Mexico High-Level Security Dialogue, just this current October, highlighted some of the successes achieved under the Bicentennial Framework since its adoption last year. While there's still much work to be done, the renewed commitment to collaboration offers hope that the U.S. and Mexico can take on the enduring security challenges that affects both countries. And all of this makes today's discussion and today's featured guest especially important. Assistant Secretary Todd Robinson is dedicated to making a lasting difference in security cooperation. I have known Todd for years from his days as ambassador to Guatemala and then the U.S. Charge in Venezuela. Incidentally, Todd was expelled and declared persona non grata by Nicolas Maduro, not only a badge of honor, but evidence of his dedicated leadership to advancing American principles. He is one of the State Department's best, and we're lucky to have him in his INL role, and we are lucky to have him with us today at the Wilson Center. Todd, it is truly great to have you here, and the podium is all yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Green, for that very kind introduction. It's really great to be here at the Wilson Center, and it's great to be among friends. That does not always happen. As you all know, on October 13th, Secretary Blinken, Attorney General Garland, and DHS Secretary Mayorkas hosted their Mexican counterparts for a very productive, high-level security dialogue. I was fortunate to be part of these meetings where we discussed several issues related to our bilateral relationship and our shared concerns about the security of our respective populations. I'm going to focus today on the global synthetic drug challenge, which our steadfast partnership with Mexico is poised to help address and which constituted a significant portion of our discussions at the HLSD. I'm happy to take questions at the end of this on any of the issues that we've covered here or anything else you might have on your mind. During the HLSD, one of the things that we kept coming back to, and I think we hit hard across all of our meetings, is this number, 108,000. That number, 108,000, is roughly the number of people who died of drug overdose in the United States last year. And that number, 108,000, was driven primarily by the consumption of synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Addressing the production, trafficking, and consumption of fentanyl is a top priority for the United States and for Mexico, a matter of national security for both countries, because even as 108,000 people died in the United States last year, thousands of Mexican citizens died as a result of the crime and violence generated by the illicit drug trade. And Mexican drug overdose deaths are on the rise as well. As Secretary Blinken said earlier this month, one priority is to protect our number one priority is to protect our citizens, Mexicans and Americans alike. The U.S. Mexico Bicentennial Framework for Security, Safe Communities, and Public Health, adopted at the HLSD last October, a year ago, continues to guide our bilateral security cooperation. The United States and Mexico remain committed to transforming our cooperation to better protect the health and safety of our citizens, prevent criminal organizations from harming our countries, and pursue criminals and bring criminal organizations to justice. I also want to emphasize that this is an interagency effort. We are all committed to and have an important role to play in raising awareness and combating the illicit synthetic drug trade, most especially fentanyl. Domestically, the United States is committing more resources to tackling substance use disorder as outlined in the President's 2022 National Drug Control Strategy by expanding access to evidence-based prevention, treatment, harm reduction, and recovery support services. Last year, the United States invested $25.1 billion in drug treatment and interdiction of illicit narcotics. Through the Bicentennial Framework, the United States and Mexico are sharing more and learning from our respective drug demand reduction efforts, including from community-based efforts right here in Washington, D.C., to improve access to treatment and recovery services. In Mexico, INL supports Mexico's public health efforts as well. In the last year, we co-hosted 3 expert roundtables on addiction prevention and treatment, provided training on evidence-based prevention and treatment of drug use disorders in support of Mexico's national strategy to prevent addictions, and helped Mexico expand access to alternative sentencing programs for low-level drug offenders in Mexico's state-level courts. 6 Mexican states have now adopted court models that refer these offenders to treatment, with another 9 in process. At the HLSD, the United States and Mexico committed to expand our respective investments in public health and to strengthen evidence-based prevention, treatment, and recovery programs. Additionally, together with Canada and Mexico, under the auspices of the North American Drug Dialogue, the United States will host a trilateral public health summit in 2023 to enhance collaboration and share best practices in drug demand reduction and public health. On the supply side, the United States and Mexico collaborated closely over the last year to prevent and disrupt the production and trafficking of illicit drugs. In addition to both countries seizing historic amounts of fentanyl, Mexico arrested the co-founder of the Guadalajara cartel and the FBI's most wanted criminal fugitive, Rafael Caro Quintero. Mexico also has a chemical watch list to flag for additional scrutiny many perfectly legal chemicals that can be diverted to illicit drug production. And Mexico expanded this list from 14 to 72 chemicals. INL is a key contributor to this effort in the past year. We've sponsored 2 exchanges with more than 250 forensic chemists from the U.S. and Mexican governments to advance understanding and identification of fentanyl precursors and synthesis. We held a series of fentanyl awareness trainings for law enforcement and courier facility operators to reduce accidental contamination that puts personnel at risk. And we hosted a workshop for Mexican prosecutors and chemists on presenting evidence of fentanyl and precursors at trial. Additionally, in the past year, we donated protective equipment to specialized units in Mexico to investigate and safely dismantle clandestine drug labs, and donated specialized detection canines to Mexican state and federal entities. INL donated canines in Mexico helped seize more than 75,000 fentanyl pills from January to August 2022. At our shared border, we completed a comprehensive study of 5 major U.S. Mexico port of entry corridors to identify ways to jointly improve our infrastructure and screening procedures to enhance our ability to detect drugs, arms, and other contraband while facilitating trade and travel. Our enduring partnership with Mexico is a crucial element of addressing the movement of deadly drugs like fentanyl into the United States. But our efforts to disrupt the illicit synthetic drug supply chain must be much broader. This is a new drug trafficking paradigm that requires a new approach for governments and the international community. We have to deepen our partnership with countries such as the People's Republic of China and India, which supply the vast majority of the world's chemicals and are hurt by criminal exploitation of their industries. Despite the PRC's irresponsible refusal to cooperate on counter-narcotics and other global issues, I will quote National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's recent comment that we, the United States, will cooperate with any country, including our geopolitical rivals, that is willing to work constructively on shared challenges. We steadfastly continue to urge the PRC to return to the table and take meaningful action to end the diversion of precursor chemicals used in illicit drug production. Since synthetic drugs pose too urgent and too complex a threat for us to fail to find common ground. We are mobilizing a global response by leveraging multilateral fora and international organizations to raise awareness of the synthetic drug threat and provide governments with tools, guidance, and capacity building to enhance their national responses to the threat and improve international cooperation. We are expanding our roster of international allies to include private industry, including the chemical, shipping, and e-commerce industries, which is uniquely positioned to disrupt transnational crime by denying criminal groups access to the tools of modern trade. Secretary Blinken said in the press availability following the HLSD, more has to be done and more will be done. The lives of our citizens depend on it. So, with that, I'm happy to turn things back over to the moderator and answer some of your questions and hear your concerns. I look forward to the continued discussion and collaborating with you all on finding and implementing innovative solutions to these critical issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Assistant Secretary Robinson. Great opening remarks. We really appreciate it. Thank you again for being here this morning. We know you have a lot going on, so we appreciate you taking some time with us. Thinking about this conversation as well as your remarks this morning, I have lots of questions, probably more than we can cover, and I suspect our audience will as well. Those of you watching at home can provide questions on our website, and we'll try to get to some of those in the amount of time we have this morning, as well as some questions from here in the room. But let me start. I'm going to go back a step, if you'll let me. The Bicentennial Framework, I think, has been understood to be a replacement or an update of Merida, which was much criticized, particularly by the López Obrador administration when they came in. So maybe you could, for people who maybe don't fully appreciate the difference, maybe you could just briefly kind of explain how Merida is, how the Bicentennial Framework is different from Merida, maybe what's included or not included, and how that leads to the efforts you were talking about this morning.
Sure. So I think the major there is a lot of overlap. Obviously, security on both sides of the border continues to be of major concern. So that has not changed. I think there is a far greater focus on public health and security and things like looking at addiction and getting treatment on both sides of the border to those who need treatment. There's far more work being done on alternatives to incarceration. on both sides of the border, looking at ways to one, help those who are caught up in the drug trade, but to look at giving them options to winding up in prison, where we know their future can be so negatively affected. But I think the third major difference between the two is the focus on the economy and looking at making security and the flow of goods between the two countries, putting them in a context where both sides are looking at focusing on the bad things that are happening on the border, while at the same time allowing illicit traffic to flow. We know that, for instance, I think the number is something like if you quicken the ability of trucks to pass through the border by 10 minutes, that is equivalent to something like $15 billion in trade between the United States and Mexico. I think the study that we did in conjunction with Mexico, looking at what are some of the things we can do that can speed up the illicit traffic, but allow the security apparatus on both sides to focus on illicit traffic, is something that perhaps Merida didn't focus on as much. So those are some of the ways that I think they are both complementary, but also differ a little bit.
Great. Thank you. Well, I'll pick up, as I said, lots of different questions, but you mentioned, you made reference to infrastructure, and there are certainly a number of projects out there trying to create new border crossings. There's talk about joint processing. The Biden administration has made a commitment to border infrastructure, as has the Mexican government. That was one of the outcomes of the presidential visit back in July. So maybe you could talk just a little bit about what are some of those plans, and maybe how does INL collaborate with DHS to consider things like joint processing, or, as you say, ways to expedite the processing?
Sure. Well, the study I mentioned in my remarks was done in collaboration with Mexico, and in fact, the conclusions of the study are with the Mexican governments now, and they are studying that. I think we will end up doing some kind of joint presentation on the study once they have taken a look at the data and studied it a bit. I think, well, number one, both the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, and DEA are among the agencies that were interested in this study. And our counterparts on the Mexican side were also obviously very interested in the study. Among the things we're looking at are the types of equipment that can be used effectively, both old school, traditional equipment, coupled with newer technology that is out there, again, that can help the security agencies on both sides do their job better, while also screening for illicit cargo and making sure that gets through as quickly as possible. There are a number of technical issues that we're looking at. We're also looking at, new facilities. Many of the facilities at these border crossings haven't been updated in a number of years, and for better or for worse, the resources to update these facilities on both sides of the border are not always where we would like them to be. So finding those resources and making sure that we can do what we need to do to update these facilities is another thing that we're looking at. And I think the third thing is there are people, there are towns, there are communities on both sides of this border, and they have needs as well. They have businesses, they have children who go to school, they have all kinds of activity. And this study also looked at, how how security and how the traffic impacts their lives. And I think that was really important and a little bit eye-opening as well. And I suspect there will be engineers, civil engineers on both sides of the border that will be very interested in the suggested changes that can be made to increase the flow, increase security, but allow these communities to have a say in their daily lives.
Right, and I think that's certainly key. Every time we do our annual border conference, those issues come up. I think those of us in capitals think of the border as being, if you will, a much thicker line than the people who live in that area.
That's
and
right.
See it as it's not that much different than a railroad crossing or anything else where you have to slow down. I think that's important. Let me ask, tie the infrastructure together with something else you talked about. There was just an article in the Washington Post maybe a week and a half ago about Mexico procuring inspection equipment from China and some concerns that raised. You were just talking about greater efforts to do joint screening and share information. You also had talked about China and its unwillingness to cooperate. One question I was going to ask you initially was about Mexican and Chinese cooperation. So maybe I guess when we try to put that all into one big question, which is maybe you could talk about, are there concerns or how is the U.S. addressing the concerns that Mexico in procuring Chinese equipment may in some ways, that may be counterproductive to what we're attempting to do?
No, I think that's a great question. It is no secret to anyone that the relationship with China is complicated. They are a major world power, and we have to find ways to cooperate with them when we can, while also standing up to them when we have to. So that is thing number one. I think the Mexicans are perhaps the Mexican government is perhaps in a better situation to try to bring China along on the shared issues that we have before us when we're talking about security and particularly the precursor chemicals, both licit and illicit, that are flowing from that area of the world. And we have encouraged the Mexicans to see if they could do more to bring China along. The issue of Chinese technology at the border is obviously one that we look at and take very seriously. First, because there are significant security concerns when you're talking about that kind of technology and information flowing back and forth between the United States and Mexico via that technology, which we've made very clear is not going to happen. But also, this is also an economic issue. There are companies in the United States and Mexico that have the ability to produce very good equipment that both countries can use. And our ambassador in Mexico, Ken Salazar, the last time we were in Mexico, brought this point up and said, "Look, this is about the ability to support the Mexican and U.S. economy by supporting those companies that are willing to create the equipment needed to allow the free flow of information between the United States and Mexico." So that's a pretty important and I think a real reason why we need to make sure that the United States and Mexico are working together as closely as possible with companies that we trust to handle the flow of information between the two countries.
Right. Well, that also certainly fits into the Biden administration's emphasis on local production. We often talk about buy North American, so I think that's an important point. Let me just ask one question, then we'll go to the audience. I think in some ways the elephant in the room when you talk about U.S. Mexico cooperation is the relationship between some of the security agencies. We know that after Cienfuegos, the relationship between the military and the U.S. deteriorated considerably. We've heard other agencies talk about concerns about their inability to engage with Mexico due to legislative changes in Mexico. So maybe if you would, Assistant Secretary Robinson, talk just a little bit about, is the Bicentennial Framework improving that relationship? What are the steps to come? Because if you can't trust each other, and I think we've all talked to folks who suggested there is not as much trust as there should be, to put it politely. Where do things stand in that regard?
Well, I would say a couple of things. You know, historically, the relationship between the United States and Mexico has had its ups and downs, and I don't have any doubt that we will see more ups and downs in the future. I think the Bicentennial Framework gives us a mechanism to continue to work together on very important issues. I would say that over the last year and a half, the relationship has actually improved significantly. Both sides have members of their security apparatus working on either side of the border, making sure that there's a flow of information and good cooperation. And we will continue to work really closely to make sure that cooperation is smooth and as fluid as possible. I know that's what DEA is trying to do, and I would invite you to have them come and address you and our partners in the Department of Justice. But I think that they will, and DHS, of course, but I think they will all say that that the Bicentennial Framework has given us greater impetus to work more closely together on both sides of the border and in both capitals.
Good. Well, we would be happy to host DEA or DHS, so if you're out there listening, please let us know. We'd love to do this with other agencies as well. Actually, I'm going to just ask one other question. We were as Ambassador Green mentioned, we were in Mexico last week. When the Mexicans talk about these issues, they talk a lot about the flow of weapons southbound. So maybe if you could just talk a little bit about what's being done. You talked about, importantly, about efforts to reduce the flow of drugs north, but maybe you could talk a little bit about the efforts to stop weapons going south.
Absolutely. And again, this is a topic that we take incredibly seriously. My colleagues in the Department of Justice, through the Bicentennial Framework, have really committed to working with U.S. other members of the interagency to look at this issue. There was just a conviction in Texas of, I think for the first time, of an arms trafficker sending weapons south, and I suspect that there will be more of that going on. We, again, as part of our commitment to the Bicentennial Framework, have taken responsibility for weapons and the money going south and trying to track that. We are doing what we can to honor that commitment in terms of investigations, in terms of sharing information, and in terms of making sure the Mexicans have what they need to go after and track the weapons should they cross the border.
Let's do this. Let me. I know we've got a number of questions from our online audience, and so maybe what we'll do is we'll take a couple questions from here in the audience, if there are any. Take a couple from the website, from the online audience, and then if we have time, we'll do a second round. Yes, please. If you could identify yourself, that would help.
Thank you. Alfonso Quiñones, I'm the ambassador of Guatemala to the United States. Thank you for the presentation. As we all know, the challenges that are being addressed by the Bicentennial Framework do not end at the border between Mexico and Guatemala. Actually, in certain cases, may be exacerbated in some of the countries south of the border. For instance, a couple of weeks ago, we interdicted a shipment of fentanyl in Guatemala. So I was wondering that if within the conversations that have happened within the framework, was there any conversation related to working with countries southbound? Because I'm sure that the success of the framework is directly related to the success that we countries south of the border will have in addressing some of those issues. So I wonder if that was part of the conversation as well. Thank you, Ambassador.
No, it's a great question. Thank you for that. Absolutely. I mean, this is we think in terms of the bilateral relationship between Mexico and the United States, but actually it is a regional. This is a regional issue, and we are. INL is fortunate to have offices in 90 countries around the world. We are obviously working very closely with our regional allies and partners in Central and South America, not only on the drug trafficking issue, which is incredibly important, but the number one issue really is migration, and so. As we continue to work with the government of Mexico, we are also doing what we can to bolster the capacity of our regional partners in Central and South America on this issue as well.
Okay, let me go to a question that came in from the online audience, which I think is a good one, and I'm just going to read it the way it was submitted to me. After so many years of INL cooperation with Mexico's prosecution service and police agencies, the levels of impunity and violence remain very high in Mexico. What is missing? And I'll augment that by saying that, the issue of impunity comes up any conversation you have in Mexico where 95% of the crimes are not addressed. It's obviously a serious concern.
It is a serious concern, and there are few higher issues than the issues of human rights for the United States government and for the State Department in particular. We continue to work with prosecutors and judges, as your listener or your participant probably knows. Mexico has been undergoing a significant judicial reform for a number of years. That reform is still underway at the federal level. But I think we've turned a corner at the state level. I think the states are, being a little more aggressive about reform and changes on the judicial side and the prosecutorial side. And they have been very open to the kinds of capacity building and training that is right in INL's wheelhouse. So, and these kinds of changes take time, often generations to get done. It's not going to happen overnight, but it is slowly happening, and it's. I would look positively towards the changes that are happening at the state level, particularly the state level along the border with the United States, between the United States and Mexico, where we've seen a great deal of positive response to judicial reform and changes.
Right. I think we've seen that in a lot of areas, in fact, related to the judiciary, that the different states are moving at different speeds. We've done some work. We have an initiative here in the Mexico Institute on femicide, and we've published some papers from University of San Diego on the femicide-specific prosecutors and what the impact of that is. So I think you're absolutely right. It does depend from state to state, but I think the challenge is to lift all of them up, because again, when you have impunity rates of 95%, it's really hard to see that as any sort of a deterrent to crime.
Well, and I would also say that we have the same challenge here in the United States, right? We see different advances in depending on where you are in the country as well.
Right. That's an important point. Are there other questions from here in the audience? Sure, please.
Thank you. My name is Luis Borunda. I'm the Deputy Secretary of State in Maryland. So we thank you for the opportunity just to ask this question very quickly. The other elephant in the room that you talked a little bit about was Chinese technology at the border. I'm just wondering if the argument couldn't be made that if Chinese technology at the border is implemented, given the massive amount of trade, given the massive amount of illegal drugs entering the country, could the argument be made that China has control of our border?
Well, they don't have control of it yet, fortunately. But I think that that's one of the reasons we want to make sure that we have absolute confidence in the technology that is being implemented at the border. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the fact that the competition just in Canada, Mexico, and the United States to produce this kind of technology is fierce. We have every expectation that we should be able to fulfill the requirements for securing the border through companies here in the region. And that's certainly our position on that issue. We are doing what we can to make sure the Mexicans are brought along in that position, and I would venture to say the Canadians are right there with us. But it's a very, very important topic.
Great, thank you, Assistant Secretary Robinson. I think we probably have time for, there's one more short question. Please. Thank you, Ambassador Brownfield.
I'm Bill Brownfield. I used to be in INL as well. Listen, this is a puffball, and if you can't handle this question as a strong closer, you should submit your resignation immediately.
But no pressure.
Five years ago, when one of your predecessors left the job, he would have said at that time there were probably 3 basic drug-related priorities on the border. In reverse order, number 3 would have been, and I will invite you to correct or update these assessments. Number 3 would have been cocaine. Why number 3? Because despite the fact that cocaine production was surging in South America and specifically in Colombia, it was not surging nearly as high in the United States, and quite frankly, we had developed over 50 years a pretty good system for dealing with cocaine. Number 2 would have been heroin, which very definitely had a Mexico component to it. And heroin had become a much more serious issue in the United States because of the opioid crisis and the largely Mexican cartels who had concluded they could actually underprice the diverted pills and domestically produced opioids by offering up cut rate bargains on heroin. The good news on all of that, by the way, was they were very aggressive in defending their market, which is why American heroin addicts today rarely are using Afghan product thanks to the Sinaloa cartel and other splendid fellows of that nature. Number 1, and this was at the end of 2017, the outgoing Assistant Secretary would have said, it is in fact opioids, and most specifically, and we've said it 15 times already today, fentanyl. And why even 5 years ago we realized fentanyl was 1, incredibly lethal, 2, was very, very easy to produce, whether in China or in Mexico or anywhere else in the world. And third, we, the United States of America, not INL. INL was perfect, of course, and I presume still is, but the United States of America was not geared up to handle fentanyl, was not geared up to handle a business-sized envelope that could have 1,000 lethal doses in it with a 60-cent stamp or whatever the hell a stamp costs these days, that could then be sent to a location in the United States of America. That was the top three as I put my back away and moved off into that sunset 5 years ago. Would you care to update, correct, or offer your own bold new vision on the priorities to come?
Well, let me just start out by saying having your former boss ask you a question at an event like this is always treacherous, but a high point. No, I think you have it about right. I would reverse the order now, and I would say opioids is number one. Cocaine continues to be number two. Heroin probably number three. And I would say precisely for the reasons you mentioned at the end, you don't need a growing season for coca or poppy. You don't need land for coca or poppy. You don't have to wait for the production cycle. Synthetic opioids are created in Mexico. They are created in Maryland. They are created in Nebraska. They are ever more lethal in more compact doses, and they are easier to hide and easier to distribute globally. We have been in continuous discussion with our European partners who initially have not been so keen to focus on synthetic opioids. And what we've been saying to them is, look at the United States now. This is your future if you don't hop on it now. And it's precisely for the reasons you mentioned that it has become the phenomena that it is.
Well, thank you. And that was indeed an excellent final question, I think, to sum things up. So I want to thank everybody for joining us here in person and virtually. Thank you, Mr. Assistant Secretary, for joining us. We hope you'll come back anytime and continue to report on the progress we're confident you're going to make with Mexico.
Thank you.
Thank you.